December 22nd, 1944, 11:30 a.m., Bastogne, Belgium. Frozen breath hung in the air as Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard watched 4 German officers approach through the snow. Their white flag stood out against the devastated landscape. They brought with them a message that would echo through history, an ultimatum demanding surrender, wrapped in the confident mockery of a certain victory. The fortune of war is changing. This time the U.S. forces in and around Bastogne have been encircled by strong German armored units. There is only one possibility to save the encircled U.S. troops from total annihilation: the honorable surrender of the encircled town. The German officers waited, supremely confident. They had every reason to be. 18,000 Americans were trapped, surrounded by approximately 30,000 German soldiers with hundreds of tanks. No supplies could reach them. The weather had grounded all Allied aircraft. The nearest relief forces were over 100 miles away. What they did not know was that, 130 miles to the south, General George S. Patton had just made a promise so audacious that even Eisenhower thought he was joking. A promise that would require moving an entire army through impossible winter conditions, faster than any military force had ever moved before. The mathematics of war was about to be rewritten, not by superior numbers or better equipment, but by the collision of German overconfidence with American determination, and by the sheer audacity of a general who refused to believe in the word impossible. The transformation had begun 6 days earlier, in the pre-dawn darkness of December 16, 1944. Precisely at 5:30 a.m., the Ardennes forest erupted with a violence not seen on the Western Front since 1940. 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front, their shells howling through the frozen air toward the unsuspecting American positions. Among them was Private First Class Robert Leckie of the 99th Infantry Division, who would later write in his diary, "The earth shook beneath us. Trees exploded into splinters. The air itself seemed to scream. We had been told the Germans were finished. We had been told wrong." This was Operation Wacht am Rhein. Watch on the Rhine. Hitler's last desperate gamble to turn the tide of the war. In absolute secrecy, the Wehrmacht assembled 410,000 soldiers, 1,400 tanks and assault guns, and 2,600 artillery pieces. They moved this massive force through the dense Eifel forests at night, maintaining radio silence, using horses to move supplies to avoid engine noise. Major General Heinz Kokott, commanding the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, recorded the moment before the attack. The soldiers stood in silence in the darkness, their breath freezing in clouds before their faces. They knew what was at stake. This was not just another offensive. This was our last chance. The target was the weakest point in the Allied line. 4 American divisions spread across difficult terrain. Many of them were new to combat or recovering from previous battles. The Germans achieved complete tactical surprise. Within hours, entire American units were overrun or retreating in chaos. But the German plan had a critical requirement: speed. They needed to capture the vital road junction at Bastogne within 48 hours. 7 main roads converged there, roads that the German tanks needed to reach their ultimate objective: the port of Antwerp, 125 miles away. Without Bastogne, the entire offensive would stall. General of Armored Troops Heinrich Freiherr von Lüttwitz commanded the 47th Panzer Corps, tasked with taking Bastogne. His force was formidable. The elite 2nd Panzer Division with 88 tanks and assault guns, the veteran Panzer Lehr Division with 57 tanks, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division with 17,000 infantry. Racing toward the same objective from the opposite direction was the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. They were resting in Reims, France, recovering from 72 days of combat in the Netherlands when the call came. No winter clothes, no time to prepare. Just get your weapons and get on the trucks. December 17th, 9 p.m. The temperature had dropped to 14 degrees as the first trucks carrying the 101st Airborne rolled through the darkness toward Bastogne. Private Donald Burgett of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment remembered the journey vividly. We passed endless columns of American troops going in the opposite direction, retreating. Some had no weapons. Many had no helmets. They shouted to us through the darkness, "Go back! Go back! They're going to kill you all!" One soldier, eyes wide with terror, grabbed my arm and said, "There are thousands of them. Tigers, panthers, everything." I pushed him away. We weren't going back. The convoy stretched for miles, 380 trucks carrying the division through the night. They had no idea what they were facing. Maps were scarce. Intelligence was contradictory. All they knew was that they had to get to Bastogne before the Germans. The 101st Airborne Division had a strength of 85 officers and 11,035 enlisted men, a total of 11,140 men. This included 4 infantry regiments, the 501st, 502nd, and 506th Parachute Infantry Regiments, plus the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, along with 4 artillery battalions and various support units. Vanguard elements of the 501st PIR reached Bastogne at 11:30 p.m. on December 18th. They had beaten the main German force by only a few hours. Team des Aubrais, a combat group from the 10th Armored Division, commanded by Major William des Aubrais, had already established a roadblock in Neuville, 3 miles north of Bastogne. At dawn on December 19th, they made the first contact with German spearheads. Sergeant William McCluskey, a tank commander with Team des Aubrais, described the initial encounter. "The fog was so thick you couldn't see 50 yards. Then we heard them, the deep rumble of German armor. When the first Panther emerged from the mist, it looked like a monster. Our 75mm rounds bounced off its front armor like ping-pong balls. We had to let them get close, dangerously close, to hit them from the side." The battle for Neuville lasted all day. Team des Aubrais, with only 15 Sherman tanks, faced the entire 2nd Panzer Division. They held out for 48 hours, destroying 31 German tanks before receiving orders to withdraw. Major des Aubrais was severely wounded when a German shell hit his command post, but his sacrifice bought precious time. December 20th brought anew commander to Bastogne. Brigadier General Anthony Clement McAuliffe arrived to take temporary command of the 101st Airborne, while Maxwell Taylor was in Washington. McAuliffe was an artillery officer by training, known for his calm demeanor under pressure. He would need every ounce of that composure in the days to come. The situation map at McAuliffe's headquarters told a grim story. German forces were closing in from 3 directions. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division was infiltrating from the south and east. Panzer Lehr was pushing from the east. Elements of the 2nd Panzer Division threatened from the north. At noon on December 20th, the last road into Bastogne, the highway to Neufchâteau, was cut. Captain Richard Winters of Easy Company, 506th PIR, positioned his men in foxholes along the perimeter. We could hear the German tanks moving in the darkness beyond our lines. The men dug their holes deeper, using helmets and bare hands when trenching tools broke in the frozen ground. The redial temperature was near 0. The men's feet were already turning black from frostbite. Inside Bastogne, the civilian population of 3,000 huddled in cellars, as German artillery began systematically destroying the town. Renée Lemaire, a 30-year-old Belgian nurse, worked tirelessly at the aid station on Rue de Neufchâteau, tending to wounded Americans and Germans alike. She would not survive the siege. The defenders of Bastogne now totaled approximately 18,000 men. The 101st Airborne Division, with its 11th to 840 personnel. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division under Colonel William Roberts, with approximately 40 operational tanks and 2,800 men. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, with its M18 Hellcats. The 969th Artillery Battalion, composed entirely of African Americans, and various other artillery and support units. December 21st dawned with visibility less than 100 yards. Thick fog mixed with snow, creating a white shroud that made movement almost impossible. The U.S. Army weather. Report described the conditions as extremely adverse for any military operations. For the Germans, this weather was a gift. It grounded the Allied fighter bombers that had terrorized German columns since D-Day. Oberleutnant von Fallois, commanding elements of the 2nd Panzer Division, observed, "The weather is our ally. Without their aircraft, the Americans are just men like us, and we have more tanks." But the weather cut both ways. German tanks struggled against the mud created by alternating cycles of freezing and thawing. Fuel consumption doubled as vehicles fought the quagmire. Supply trucks jackknifed on icy roads. Wounded men froze to death before medical help could reach them. Inside the Bastogne perimeter, ammunition was running dangerously low. Artillery was rationed to 10 rounds per gun per day. Medical supplies were virtually exhausted after the capture of the medical company on December 19th. Morphine had to be reserved only for the most severe casualties. Food supplies dwindled to 1 meal a day. Private First Class James Sims of the 101st later recalled, "We were eating snow for water. My buddy next to me in the foxhole had his feet freeze in his boots. When the medic finally cut them off, his toes came away with them. He didn't even cry. He was beyond feeling anything." 130 miles south of Bastogne, in Verdun, a very different scene unfolded on December 19th. In a cold, damp French barracks, heated by a single iron stove, Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower called an emergency conference with his senior commanders. The room was filled with the top brass of the Allied forces: Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, and Lieutenant General George S. Patton. Major General Kenneth Strong, Eisenhower's intelligence chief, had just finished the briefing on the German advance. The silence that followed was oppressive. Eisenhower broke it with words that would define the American response. "The present situation is to be regarded as an opportunity for us, and not as a disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this conference table." Patton smiled immediately. "Hell, let's have the guts to let the sons of Bicows go all the way to Paris. Then we'll really cut 'em off and chew 'em up." Eisenhower grew serious. "George, I need you to attack north. How soon can you disengage from your current offensive and pivot toward Bastogne?" What Patton said next shocked every officer in the room. "I can attack with 3 divisions. In 48 hours?" The room exploded in disbelief. Air Marshal Arthur Tedder even laughed. "Move an entire corps 90 degrees in winter conditions across 100 miles of icy roads in 48 hours? It was impossible. Eisenhower's face turned red. "Don't be fatuous, George. If you try to go that early, you won't have all 3 divisions ready, and you'll go in piecemeal. You will be destroyed." But Patton wasn't boasting. For 3 days, his brilliant operations officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, had been warning him of the German concentration in the Ardennes. Patton had already prepared 3 different operational plans for exactly this contingency. He had pre-positioned fuel depots, ammunition supplies, and medical units along potential routes to the north. "I'm not being fatuous, Ike," Patton replied calmly. "I've already issued preliminary orders. My staff is working on 3 possible axes of advance. All I need is your word." He pulled out a map and showed Eisenhower the routes. "I'll use Milliken's 3 corps. The 4th Armored will lead, followed by the 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions. We'll hit them from Arlon, driving straight for Bastogne." Eisenhower studied the map. The distance was staggering. The weather was abysmal. The roads were sheets of ice. But Bastogne had to be relieved. "When can you start?" "On the morning of December 22nd. "Do it." As he left the meeting, Patton called his headquarters with a pre-arranged code word: "Play ball." Those 2 words set in motion one of the most remarkable operational maneuvers in military history. Within hours, 133,000 vehicles began moving north. The entire Third Army, 250,000 men, had to be reoriented. Supply depots that had been positioned for an offensive into Germany had to be relocated. 20,000 miles of telephone wire had to be reinstalled. Artillery positions calculated for one direction had to be completely recalculated for another. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, received his orders at 7 p.m. on December 19th. His unit had to move 150 miles in 19 hours through a blizzard. "We drove with blackout lights through the night," he later recalled. Tank commanders stood in their turrets, freezing, guiding drivers who couldn't see the road. Men slept standing up and had to be physically shaken awake. The logistics were staggering. Each Sherman tank consumed 175 gallons of fuel for the trip. The division needed 50,000 gallons just to reach the starting line. Fuel trucks drove continuously, many sliding off icy roads into ditches. When trucks broke down, fuel was transferred by hand using 5-gallon jerry cans. Master Sergeant Frank Carousel of the 4th Armored's Maintenance Company worked for 72 hours straight. "We changed track blocks on tanks while they were still moving into position. Men's hands froze to the metal. We had cases where the skin came off when they pulled their hands away, but nobody stopped. We all knew those. Paratroopers in Bastogne were counting on us." Back in Bastogne, the situation had become critical. The perimeter had shrunk to less than 16 miles. German artillery had zeroed in on every strong point. Aid stations were overflowing with wounded. At 11:30 a.m. on December 22nd, 4 German officers approached the American lines under a white flag. They were met by soldiers of Company F, 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. The German party consisted of Major Wagner of the 47th Panzer Corps, Lieutenant Helmuth Henke of the Panzer Operations Section, and 2 enlisted soldiers from the 901st Panzer Grenadier Regiment. Major Wagner carried an ultimatum typed on 2 sheets, one in English and one in German. The English version had been typed on an English typewriter, with German diacritical marks added by hand. Upon being brought to the command post, the message was immediately taken to General McAuliffe, who was taking a brief nap in the cellar of the Belgian barracks serving as headquarters. When Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore woke him and said, "The Germans have sent some people over to accept our surrender," McAuliffe's immediate response was, "Nuts!" His staff gathered as he read the full German message aloud. It spoke of the desperate position of the American forces, warning that German artillery was ready to annihilate the U.S. troops, and that only surrender could save them from total annihilation. Colonel Moore asked what the response should be. McAuliffe was genuinely puzzled. "Well, I don't know what to say." Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard spoke up. That first thing you said would be hard to beat, General. McAuliffe laughed. You mean nuts? The room exploded in agreement. McAuliffe sat down and wrote the reply to the German commander that would become legendary. Nuts. To the German commander, from the American commander. When Colonel Joseph Harper delivered the reply to the waiting German officers, they were confused. Nuts? What does that mean? Harper couldn't resist. It means go to hell. And I'll tell you one more thing. If you attack again, we'll kill every goddamn German who tries to get into this town. Major Wagner stiffened. We will kill many Americans. This is war. On your way, bud, Harper replied. And good luck to you. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, later admitted he was surprised the ultimatum was even sent. The Panzer Lehr Division sent an emissary to Bastogne without my authorization. The demand for surrender was refused, as was to be expected. The German reaction to McAuliffe's defiant response was swift and brutal. That night, the Luftwaffe launched its first major bombing raid on Bastogne. For the defenders in their foxholes, it was a preview of hell. Corporal Walter Gordon of Easy Company described the bombardment. The ground shook like an earthquake. Trees exploded into flames. Shrapnel whizzed through the air like angry hornets. We pressed ourselves against the frozen earth and prayed. The temperature plummeted to about 10 degrees. In foxholes along the perimeter, men took turns sleeping to avoid freezing to death. They learned to urinate in empty ration cans rather than leave their holes. Exposure for even a few minutes could mean death from sniper fire or frostbite. Food had become desperate. The official ration was 1 K ration per day, about 2,800 calories, when men needed 4,000 in the extreme cold. Soldiers learned to save the wax-coated cardboard from ration boxes. It burned just long enough to heat a canteen cup of snow into drinking water. Technical Sergeant Donald Malarkey found a creative solution. We discovered that the dead German horses, there were hundreds of them, were frozen, fresh meat. We'd cut off slabs with bayonets and cooked them over fires made from broken ammunition crates. It tasted terrible, but it kept us alive. December 24th brought hope and horror to Bastogne. The weather had finally begun to clear, raising hopes for aerial resupply, but it also allowed the Luftwaffe to launch its most devastating attack. At 8:30 p.m. on Christmas Eve, German bombers appeared over Bastogne. One of their bombs made a direct hit on the aid station where René Lemaire worked. The building collapsed, trapping dozens of wounded soldiers and medical personnel. Corporal Kenneth Moore was outside when the bomb struck. I heard the explosion and ran toward the building. Where the aid station had been was just a pile of rubble. We could hear voices down there, men screaming for help, calling for their mothers. We dug with our bare hands through the night, pulling out bodies. Miss Lemaire was dead. She had stayed with the wounded, who could not be moved. 30. American soldiers died in that single bombing along with the Belgian nurse who had become a symbol of hope for the wounded. Augusta Chiwi, a Congolese-Belgian nurse, survived and continued treating the wounded for 30 consecutive hours after the bombing. As Tatiuni, Christmas Eve turned into Christmas Day. Patton's Third Army battled blizzard conditions. The attack that had begun on December 22nd was behind schedule. The 4th Armored Division had advanced only 7 miles in 3 days. Patton, who was never one for traditional military solutions, summoned his chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill, on December 22nd. Chaplain, I want you to publish a prayer for good weather. I am tired of seeing these soldiers having to fight mud and floods as well as Germans. See if you can get God to work on our side. O'Neill was doubtful. "Sir, it's going to take a pretty thick rug for that kind of praying." "I don't care if it takes a flying carpet," Patton replied. "I want you to prepare a prayer for good weather." The prayer was printed on 250,000 cards and distributed to every soldier in the Third Army. "Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech Thee, of Thy great goodness, to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle, whether by divine intervention or meteorological coincidence." December 23rd dawned crystal clear. For the first time in a week, the sun broke through the clouds. The change in weather was miraculous. After 7 days of impenetrable fog and snow, visibility suddenly extended for 10 miles. The temperature rose above freezing for the first time in a week. More importantly, Allied air forces could finally fly. At 9:50 a.m., the first Pathfinder aircraft appeared over Bastogne, dropping colored smoke to mark the drop zones. By 11:50 a.m., the sky was filled with C-47 transport planes, 241 of them in perfect formation. Sergeant Jack Agnew of the Pathfinder team recalled, "We dropped purple smoke to mark the drop zone. Then we heard them, a low rumble that grew into a roar. The sky turned black with aircraft. The most beautiful sight I've ever seen." The paratroopers in Bastogne erupted in cheers. Men climbed out of foxholes, waving their helmets, many with tears streaming down their faces. For 7 days, they had been alone. Now the sky was full of help. The first parachutes opened at 11:55 a.m. Supplies began to rain down: ammunition, medical supplies, food, blankets, and most critically, artillery shells. Of the 1,446 bundles dropped, 95% were successfully recovered. Captain James Parker of the 101st G4 Logistics Section coordinated the recovery. Men ran under artillery fire to grab those bundles. I saw one soldier hit by shrapnel get up and drag a bundle to cover, with blood streaming down his face. But the Germans did not stand still. Anti-aircraft guns positioned around Bastogne opened fire. The C-47s had to fly straight and level at 1,000 feet to drop accurately. They were sitting ducks. By December 26th, aircraft had delivered 1,020.7 tons by parachute and 92.4 tons by glider. The largest airlift occurred on December 26th, with 289 planes flying the Bastogne route. At 2:45 a.m. on Christmas morning, German artillery launched the heaviest barrage yet on Bastogne. For 2 hours, shells rained down on American positions. Then, at 5:30 a.m., 18 Panzer Mark V tanks from the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, accompanied by infantry in white camouflage, attacked the western perimeter. The attack was led by Lieutenant Colonel Wolfgang Mauke. His orders from General McAuliffe were simple: Bastogne must fall today. It is the Führer's Christmas wish. The German tanks broke through the first line of foxholes held by Company A, 327th Glider Infantry. Private First Class Kenneth Hendricks was in the second line. The ground shook with the tank engines. In the dawn light, they looked like monsters. Our bazooka rounds bounced off their armor, but the Americans had positioned their tank destroyers perfectly. The M-18 Hellcats of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion were hidden in ruined buildings. As the German tanks passed, they opened fire into the flanks. Sergeant Bill Harper commanded one of the Hellcats. "We let them pass, then we hit them in the Uichi-wide rear where the armor was thin." My gunner, Corporal Johnson, was incredible. 5 shots, 3 kills. By 10 a.m., all 18 German tanks were burning wrecks. Nearly 400 German soldiers lay dead in the snow. A captured German officer told his interrogators, "Your defense was magnificent. We knew after this morning that we could not take Bastogne." General McAuliffe issued his Christmas message to the troops, recounting the German surrender demand and his response, adding, "We have stopped cold. Everything that has been thrown at us from the north, east, south, and west." December 26th, 4:00 p.m., Lieutenant Charles Boggess, commanding the Sherman tank Cobra King of the 37th Tank Battalion, looked through his periscope at the Belgian village of Assenois, only 4 miles from Bastogne. For 4 days, the 4th Armored Division had fought through German positions, advancing yard by bloody yard. The final assault began at 2:20 p.m. Lieutenant Colonel Crichton Abrams ordered his battalion forward, while calling for artillery support. "I want every gun you've got," he radioed. Within minutes, 2,340 rounds of artillery were falling on German positions around Assenois. Boggess remembered the moment. "I could see German troops running from their foxholes as our artillery swept their positions." When the barrage lifted, Abrams gave the order, "Move out." We attacked at full speed, every gun firing. Private James Hendricks, bow machine gunner on Cobra King, described the advance. "We went through that town like a hot knife through butter. Germans were shooting at us from windows, doors, everywhere. Our 75mm main gun was swinging left and right, firing point-blank into buildings." At 4:50 p.m., Cobra King crested a small rise, and Boggess saw American soldiers ahead. They were engineers from the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion, the outer perimeter of the Bastogne defenses. "Come on in," the engineers shouted. "You're the first tanks we've seen in 10 days." Boggess radioed, "Abrams, contact with friendly forces established." The siege was broken, but the cost was terrible. The 37th Tank Battalion lost 5 dead, 22 wounded, and 5 missing in the breakthrough. The 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion suffered 30 dead and 180 wounded. But the corridor, though only 400 yards wide, was open. News of the breakthrough spread through Bastogne like wildfire. Men who had been rationing every round of ammunition fired entire clips into the air in celebration. Wounded soldiers in aid stations cheered despite their pain. General McAuliffe, maintaining his trademark calm, said only, "We're glad to see you, fellas." But for the Germans, the psychological impact was devastating. Major General Kokot wrote in his diary, "The relief of Bastogne is a disaster, not just tactically, but morally. Our soldiers no longer believe we can win. They have seen American determination, and it has broken their spirit." Oberleutnant Kaufmann of the Panzer Division was more direct. "We threw everything we had at Bastogne, our best troops, our last reserves of tanks and ammunition. And for what? They held, and when we demanded their surrender, they laughed at us. Nuts." That single word did more damage to German morale than 1,000 bombs. The defenders began with approximately 18,000 men. By December 26th, the 101st Airborne Division's casualties from December 19th to January 6th would total 341 dead, 1,691 wounded, and 516 missing. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division suffered approximately 500 casualties. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion destroyed 108 German armored vehicles, losing only 17 Hellcats. German losses around Bastogne were catastrophic. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division suffered over 60% casualties. Panzer Lehr lost 42 tanks. The 2nd Panzer Division, which bypassed Bastogne to drive toward the Meuse River, ran out of fuel just 4 miles from the river and was destroyed by the U.S. 2nd Armored Division. December 27th brought even clearer weather, and with it came the full might of Allied air power. From December 23 to 27, Allied aircraft flew over 34,000 sorties. The Luftwaffe, which had started the offensive with 2,000 aircraft, was reduced to fewer than 300 operational planes within a week. Flight Lieutenant Pierre Klosterman of the RAF flew a Tempest fighter bomber over the battlefield. It was what we called a tank hunt. The Germans had no air cover. We would dive from 8,000 feet, release our rockets at 2,000 feet, and pull up. Below us, German vehicles were burning for miles. The most devastating attack occurred on December 26th, when 294 RAF Lancaster bombers attacked German positions around St. Vith, dropping 1,140 tons of bombs. Every road in a 3-kilometer radius was made impassable. Unteroffizier Hans Behrens of the 18th Volksgrenadier Division survived the attack. The earth erupted. Buildings disintegrated. Men just vanished, vaporized. When it was over, I crawled out of my shelter to find a moonscape. General McAuliffe specifically credited the 19th Tactical Air Command. If it had not been for your splendid cooperation, we would never have been able to hold out. Throughout the siege, something remarkable had been happening within the German forces. A psychological transformation that Allied intelligence would not fully understand until after the war. German soldiers had gone into the offensive full of propaganda about weak, pampered Americans who would run at the first sign of serious combat. But what they found at Bastogne destroyed those illusions. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann of the 26th Volksgrenadier wrote to his wife on December 24th. The letter was found on his body. The Americans are not what they told us. They fight like devils. Yesterday, I saw a single American machine gun team hold up an entire company for 3 hours. Major Johann Krag of the Panzer-Lehr Division was captured on December 27th. His interrogation statement was remarkable. You won not because of your numbers or weapons, but because of spirit. In Bastogne, we learned that American soldiers are warriors. While the defense of Bastogne dominated the headlines, Patton's relief operation represented something even more remarkable: a revolution in operational warfare. The numbers remain staggering. In 72 hours, Patton's Third Army moved 250,000 men over 100 miles of icy roads, repositioned 133,000 vehicles without a single major traffic jam. It installed 20,000 miles of telephone wire. It established 70 new ammunition supply points. It created 40 fuel depots with 500,000 gallons of gasoline, set up 20 field hospitals, delivered 4,000 tons of ammunition, and distributed 62,000 maps. Colonel Oscar Koch, Patton's G2 intelligence officer, later wrote, "What Patton achieved in those 3 days should have been impossible. We calculated it would take a minimum of 6 days just to plan such a movement." The secret was preparation. Unknown to most, Patton had been simulating this exact scenario for 2 weeks. When other generals dismissed the possibility of a German offensive, Patton had ordered his staff to prepare detailed contingency plans. The medical achievements during the siege deserve special recognition. Despite the capture of most medical supplies and personnel on December 19th, doctors and medics saved lives at remarkable rates. Major Randell Bowman, chief surgeon of the 101st Airborne, performed 167 operations in 10 days, many without proper anesthesia. We operated by candlelight when the generators failed. We used cognac from Belgian houses when the morphine ran out. Technical Sergeant Eugene Rowe of Easy Company treated over 200 wounded during the siege, often crawling through artillery barrages to reach casualties. He never carried a weapon, only medical supplies. The successful defense of Bastogne and Patton's relief operation had consequences far beyond tactical victory. Hitler's Great Offensive, intended to split the Allied armies and recapture Antwerp, had been halted, cold. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, German overall commander in the West, admitted in his post-war interrogation, "Bastogne was the graveyard of the Ardennes offensive. We needed that road junction by December 18th. When the Americans held for a week and then were reinforced, we knew the offensive had failed. The Germans had committed their entire strategic reserve, 25 divisions, to the offensive. In 6 weeks of fighting, they suffered between 81,000 and 98,000 casualties, lost over 600 tanks and assault guns and 1,000 aircraft. These were losses Germany could never replace. American casualties were also severe, approximately 75,000 killed, wounded, or missing, with 19,000 dead. But America could replace those losses. In January 1945, new divisions were arriving from the United States at the rate of 1 per week. Most importantly, the offensive had exhausted Germany's last reserves. When the Soviets launched their winter offensive on January 12, 1945, Germany had no strategic reserves to shift to the east. The road to Berlin was open. The Battle of Bastogne created legends that endure today. McAuliffe's "nuts" response entered American military folklore as the epitome of defiance. Patton's relief march became a textbook example studied in military academies worldwide. In December 1984, veterans from both sides returned to Bastogne for the 40th anniversary. Former enemies met as friends. General McAuliffe, then 87, gave the keynote speech. "We fought here not for conquest, but for freedom. We fought not for hatred, but for duty. And when it was over, we helped rebuild what war had destroyed." Former Hauptmann Hans Detmer of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, who returned for the anniversary, said, "I came here as a conqueror in 1944. I return as a friend. The Americans we fought showed us what democracy really means, not weakness, but strength." Today, the Mardasson Memorial stands on a hill overlooking Bastogne, a star-shaped monument honoring the 76 Saktut 1990 American soldiers killed in the Battle of the Bulge. Every December 16th at 5:30 a.m., the exact moment the German offensive began, bells toll throughout Bastogne. In the town square sits the Sherman tank Barracuda of the 11th Armored Division. Children play on it, climbing the same armor that liberated their grandparents. Vincent Speranza, the paratrooper who brought beer to wounded soldiers, returned many times to Bastogne before his death. The town brewery created Airborne beer in his honor. On his last visit in 2019, at age 96, he raised a glass and said, "To the boys who didn't come home, to the people who never forgot, to freedom." Final statistics for the Bastogne operation remain staggering. American forces in Bastogne, initial garrison of 18,000, including 11,840 from the 101st Airborne. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored, 40 operational tanks. Total American casualties in Bastogne, approximately 4,500. German forces committed to Bastogne, initial strength of $25,000 to 30,000, eventually increased to approximately 55,000. German casualties around Bastogne, over 15,000. Tanks lost, over 100. Patton's relief force, 250,000 men pivoted north. 133,000 vehicles moved. Advance of over 100 miles in winter conditions. Breakthrough achieved in 5 days. Supply operations, 1,200 tons delivered by air. 961 C-47 missions flown. 241 aircraft on December 23rd alone. 95% recovery rate of airdropped supplies. Weather data, 168 consecutive hours below freezing. Lowest temperature of approximately 10 degrees. Visibility from December 19th to 22th, less than 100 yards. Clear weather began on December 23rd. Winston Churchill, addressing Parliament in January 1945, declared, "This is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery admitted, "The Americans at Bastogne wrote one of the most beautiful chapters in military history. Their resistance will be remembered as long as men honor courage." But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from former Wehrmacht General Heinrich von Luttwitz, whose 47th Panzer Corps had encircled Bastogne. In 1954, visiting the memorial, he saluted and said, "They were magnificent enemies who became best friends. They fought not for conquest, but for principle. For that, they deserved to win." The German forces who mocked the trapped Americans at Bastogne learned a profound lesson in those frozen days of December 1944. They learned that free men fighting for each other are stronger than any army fighting for conquest. They learned that determination matters more than numbers. They learned that when democracy is pushed to the limit, it reacts with a force that tyranny can never match. The relief of Bastogne remains as proof that freedom, when truly threatened, will always find its champions. In December 1944, those champions wore the Screaming Eagle of the 101st Airborne and the triangle of Patton's Third Army. They were teenagers, from Iowa farms and New York tenements, from Texas ranches and California factories. They were America. On a quiet hill outside Bastogne sits a foxhole preserved exactly as it was in December 1944. A plaque beside it bears a simple inscription. Words spoken by a young paratrooper whose name is lost to history, but whose spirit lives forever. "They've got us surrounded. The poor bastards." That magnificent defiance, that refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat seemed certain. That was the spirit of Bastogne. It was the spirit that held the line against tyranny. It was the spirit that brought Patton's tanks roaring through the snow. And when the moment came, when freedom itself was on the line, they answered with a word that will echo for all eternity. Nuts. The German mockery died in the snow around Bastogne, buried under the thunder of Patton's advancing tanks, and the unconquerable spirit of the encircled paratroopers who simply refused to quit. In its place grew respect, then admiration, and finally friendship. The fortress of democracy had held. The arsenal of freedom had triumphed, and in that triumph, the future of the free world was secured.